September 3rd, 1943. Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. 2:47 a.m. The rusted Liberty ship SS William Clark creaked against the wooden pier as Obergfreiter Hans Müller pressed his face against the small porthole, his breath fogging the salt-stained glass. Through the pre-dawn darkness, he watched American longshoremen moving with mechanical precision, their voices carrying across the water in a language he barely understood. The metallic clang of cargo hooks echoed through the humid Virginia air as massive cranes larger than any he had ever seen in Hamburg swung containers through the darkness with an almost casual efficiency. Hans had been captured 3 months earlier in Sicily, and during the long voyage across the Atlantic, he had convinced himself that the stories of American industrial capacity were propaganda, desperate lies told by a nation that surely could not match the engineering precision of the Reich. He was about to discover just how catastrophically wrong he was. What Hans Müller didn't know, as he clutched his few remaining possessions and prepared to disembark into captivity, was that he was about to witness the most overwhelming display of industrial dominance in human history. This wasn't simply about being a prisoner of war. He was about to become a front-row observer to a manufacturing avalanche that would systematically demolish everything he thought he knew about his homeland's military capabilities. The America that was about to unfold before his eyes wasn't just producing more tanks, more planes, and more ships than Germany. It was producing them at a rate so incomprehensible, so utterly beyond the scope of German industrial capacity, that it would shatter the fundamental assumptions upon which the entire Nazi war machine had been built. The story of German prisoners of war confronting American industrial might is not merely a tale of military production statistics. It is the story of two entirely different philosophies of warfare colliding with devastating finality. While Germany had built its war machine on the principle of quality over quantity, producing sophisticated weapons in limited numbers with meticulous craftsmanship, America had unleashed something far more terrifying: the systematic application of mass production techniques that could bury any enemy under an avalanche of standardized, reliable, and overwhelmingly numerous war materials. The German prisoners who arrived on American shores between 1943 and 1945 had been indoctrinated to believe in the superiority of German engineering, the invincibility of German military technology, and the inevitable triumph of German industrial precision. They were about to discover that precision means nothing when it can be overwhelmed by abundance, that quality becomes irrelevant when confronted by quantity of such massive proportions that it defies comprehension, and that the very concept of total war had been redefined by a nation that could simultaneously fight a global conflict while increasing the living standards of its civilian population. This was not a contest between equals. This was the industrial equivalent of an avalanche meeting a picket fence. As Hans Müller's transport train rolled through the American countryside in September 1943, he found himself pressed against the window, trying to process what he was seeing. The locomotive itself was a revelation, a massive diesel-electric monster that dwarfed the steam engines he knew from Germany, pulling what seemed to be an endless chain of identical freight cars. Each car appeared to have been manufactured from the same template, painted in the same colors, built to the same specifications with an uniformity that spoke of truly mechanized production. But it was the landscape that truly began to shatter his preconceptions. Through Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, the train passed factory after factory, each one larger than anything he had seen in the Ruhr Valley. Smokestacks reached toward the sky like a forest of industrial trees, belching the byproducts of production that never seemed to stop. Even in the middle of the night, these facilities blazed with electric light, their parking lots filled with automobiles that gleamed under street lamps with a standardization that was both beautiful and terrifying. Fellow prisoner Feldwebel Kurt Schneider, who had commanded a panzer unit in North Africa before his capture, later wrote in his diary, "The Americans have built factories the size of our entire industrial districts. What we accomplish with 1,000 workers, they accomplish with machines operated by 100. The scale is beyond comprehension. We have been fighting an enemy whose industrial capacity we never truly understood. The numbers were indeed beyond comprehension." In 1943, as Hans and Kurt watched America roll past their transport windows, the United States was producing 85,898 aircraft, more than double Germany's total production of 40,593. But raw numbers only told part of the story. While Germany's aircraft production was scattered across hundreds of small facilities, often housed in converted workshops, and constantly vulnerable to bombing, American aircraft rolled off assembly lines that operated with the precision of automotive manufacturing. The Willow Run plant in Michigan alone, a single facility that the German prisoners would learn about through camp newspapers, was producing B-24 Liberator bombers at a rate of one every 63 minutes at peak production. When the transport stopped briefly in Detroit, Hans glimpsed the Ford River Rouge complex through the train window. The facility stretched beyond the horizon, its smokestacks and assembly buildings creating what looked like an industrial city unto itself. What he didn't know was that this single complex employed more workers than the entire German aircraft industry, and was simultaneously producing jeeps, tanks, aircraft engines, and prefabricated Liberty ship sections, while maintaining automobile production for the civilian market. This was Hans's first encounter with the concept that would define his captivity. American industry didn't choose between military and civilian production. It simply produced more of everything. The prisoners' train finally arrived at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, on September 7, 1943. As they disembarked, Hans noticed immediately that even the prisoner of war camp itself was a testament to American industrial capacity. The barracks were prefabricated structures, identical in every detail, that had obviously been mass-produced in some distant factory and shipped to this location ready for assembly. The camp's perimeter fence was made from machine-produced wire in perfectly uniform patterns, strung between steel posts that bore the telltale marks of mechanized manufacturing. But it was during the processing procedure that Hans received his second major shock. The American uniforms worn by the guards were remarkable in their consistency and quality. Every button, every zipper, every piece of fabric appeared to have been manufactured to exacting standards and was identical across hundreds of soldiers. The leather boots showed no variation in stitching, color, or construction. Most remarkably, nothing appeared to be repaired or patched. Everything looked new, as if the entire American military was perpetually supplied with fresh equipment. This stood in stark contrast to the German military Hans had known, where soldiers routinely repaired their equipment, patched their uniforms, and made do with whatever materials were available. German military efficiency had always emphasized careful maintenance and conservation of resources. The Americans seemed to operate under the assumption that it was easier to provide new equipment than to repair old equipment, an assumption that revealed a depth of industrial capacity that Hans was only beginning to understand. The camp's American commander, Colonel James Morrison, unknowingly provided Hans with his first lesson in American logistics during the initial prisoner briefing. "You will be provided," Colonel Morrison announced in broken German, "with 2 complete uniforms, underwear, socks, boots, toiletries, writing materials, recreational equipment, and access to educational programs. These supplies will be replaced as needed, without requisition or rationing." Hans exchanged glances with his fellow prisoners. Without rationing, the concept was almost incomprehensible. Even before the war, civilian goods in Germany had been subject to various forms of allocation and conservation. The idea that prisoners of war enemy soldiers would receive unlimited access to basic supplies suggested an economy that operated on entirely different principles than anything they had experienced. The proof came within days. When Hans's issued boots showed wear after 2 weeks of camp labor, he mentioned this to an American guard, expecting to be directed to a repair facility or told to make do. Instead, the guard simply requisitioned a new pair from the camp supply depot. When Hans asked what would happen to the worn boots, the guard seemed puzzled by the question. "They'll probably be thrown away," he said with a shrug. "It's cheaper to issue new ones than to set up a repair shop. Cheaper to throw away boots than to repair them." This casual statement revealed the economic reality that would define every aspect of Hans's American captivity. Abundance so overwhelming that conservation became economically inefficient. As the months passed and Hans settled into the routine of camp life, American newspapers became his window into the true scale of his homeland's disadvantage. The numbers, when he could piece them together from English-language sources and conversations with guards, painted a picture of industrial disparity that defied belief. In 1943, while Germany produced 19,800 tanks, the United States manufactured 29,497 tanks and self-propelled guns. But even this comparison understated the reality, because American tank production was accelerating while German production was beginning to strain under the pressure of strategic bombing and resource shortages. By 1944, American tank production would peak at 17,565 Sherman tanks alone, nearly matching Germany's total armored vehicle production, while representing only one model of American tank. The disparity in naval construction was even more staggering. Germany's entire submarine fleet, the Kriegsmarine's primary weapon against Allied shipping, consisted of approximately 1,162 U-boats built over the course of the entire war. In 1943 alone, the United States launched 1,896 merchant vessels, each one larger and more sophisticated than the typical German submarine. The Liberty ships that Hans had arrived on represented just one class of American merchant vessel, and they were being produced at the rate of 3 per day at peak production. But it was aircraft production that revealed the true scope of American industrial dominance. In 1944, the United States produced 96,318 aircraft of all types, more than twice Germany's peak annual production of 40,593 inches 1,944. More importantly, American aircraft production was supported by an equally overwhelming production of trained pilots. While Germany struggled to provide adequate flight training due to fuel shortages and the constant threat of bombing, American pilot training programs graduated more airmen than Germany could produce aircraft to put them in. Hans learned these numbers gradually, piecing together information from camp newspapers, conversations with guards, and the occasional letter from home that made it through the censors. Each new statistic forced him to recalculate everything he thought he knew about the war's eventual outcome. If America could produce aircraft at twice the rate of Germany while simultaneously fighting Japan in the Pacific, conducting massive bombing campaigns in Europe, and supplying Allied forces around the globe, what did that say about Germany's chances of victory? The answer became clear through a conversation with Technical Sergeant Robert Kelly, one of the camp's guards who had previously worked in a defense plant in Ohio. "The thing is," Kelly explained to Hans during one of their informal English lessons, "we're not even at full production yet. The factories are working at maybe 70% capacity because we don't want to wear out the equipment. If we really needed to, we could probably double production again. 70% capacity." Hans struggled to process this information. Germany was straining every resource, converting civilian production to military use, implementing slave labor, and still falling behind. America was operating at 3/4 capacity while maintaining civilian production of automobiles, appliances, and consumer goods. The true scope of American industrial might reveal itself not through dramatic demonstrations but through the accumulated weight of countless small observations. It was the fact that camp meals were served on identical mass-produced plates, using identical mass-produced utensils. It was the realization that the camp's American personnel changed their uniforms regularly rather than repairing them. It was the discovery that broken equipment was typically replaced rather than fixed. Hans's most profound revelation came during a work assignment at a nearby American airbase, where prisoners were employed in non-sensitive maintenance tasks. The base, Keesler Field, was a training facility for radio operators and aircraft mechanics. What struck Hans immediately was not the sophistication of the aircraft, though the AT-6 Texan trainers were indeed impressive, but the casual abundance that surrounded everything. The base operated dozens of training aircraft, each one meticulously maintained and regularly replaced. Spare parts were available without requisition delays. Fuel seemed unlimited. Most remarkably, the base was simultaneously training hundreds of mechanics and radio operators, suggesting that America was not only producing aircraft faster than Germany, but was also producing trained personnel to maintain and operate those aircraft at an equally overwhelming rate. During his assignment, Hans observed American maintenance procedures and was struck by their systematic efficiency. Rather than carefully conserving parts and repairing components multiple times, American mechanics followed standardized procedures that emphasized speed and reliability. Components were replaced according to predetermined schedules rather than being used until failure. This approach required a massive supply chain, capable of delivering precise parts to exact specifications on predictable schedules, a level of industrial coordination that Hans had never encountered. The base's commanding officer, Colonel William Harrison, inadvertently provided Hans with another window into American thinking during a casual conversation. The key to winning this war, Colonel Harrison mentioned, isn't having the best equipment. It's having enough good equipment that we can replace losses faster than the enemy can inflict them. Our pilots don't need to be perfect because we can train new ones. Our planes don't need to last forever because we can build new ones. This philosophy represented a fundamental departure from German military doctrine, which emphasized the careful preservation of elite units and sophisticated equipment. Germany had trained its military leaders to think in terms of conservation and efficiency. America had built a military machine that could absorb massive losses and continue operating without disruption. By 1944, Hans had access to a broader range of information through the camp library and educational programs designed to prepare prisoners for eventual repatriation. Reading American magazines and newspapers with improving English skills, he began to understand the mathematical foundations of American industrial supremacy. The numbers were staggering in their comprehensiveness. America was not simply outproducing Germany in one or two categories of military equipment. It was overwhelming German production across every measurable metric simultaneously. In 1944, America produced 96,318 aircraft to Germany's 40,593. It manufactured 17,565 tanks to Germany's 19,002. It launched 2,247 naval vessels to Germany's 1,156. It produced 41.3 million tons of steel to Germany's 28.5 million tons. But these raw production figures only told part of the story. America was achieving this production while maintaining civilian manufacturing that Germany had entirely converted to military use. American automobile production in 1944, though reduced from peacetime levels, still exceeded 69,500 vehicles, all for civilian use. Germany had converted its entire automotive industry to military production and was still being outproduced by America's residual civilian capacity. The implications were mathematically inevitable. Germany was fighting a war of attrition against an opponent that could sustain losses at rates that would destroy any other nation. American industrial capacity was so vast that the United States could simultaneously equip its own military, supply the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease, support British production, and maintain domestic civilian production at levels that exceeded Germany's total wartime output. Hans discovered the Lend-Lease statistics through a conversation with Captain David Thompson, who had been assigned to manage the camp's educational programs. The numbers were devastating in their implications. By 1944, America had provided the Soviet Union with 13,303 aircraft, 35,170 tanks, and massive quantities of trucks, locomotives, communications equipment, and raw materials. This meant that America was not only equipping its own forces at rates exceeding German production, but was simultaneously equipping entire Allied armies with equipment that never appeared in American military statistics. The mathematical reality was overwhelming. Germany was fighting not just against American production but against American production multiplied by American capacity to supply allies. The Soviet T-34 tanks rolling toward Berlin were powered by American engines. The British bombers attacking German cities were navigating with American instruments. The logistics networks that supported Allied operations worldwide were built on American trucks, American locomotives, and American ships. The thing you have to understand, Captain Thompson explained during one of their discussions, is that America's goal isn't to match German production. It's to exceed German production by such a margin that numerical superiority becomes decisive regardless of qualitative differences. Hans's understanding of American industrial philosophy deepened during a work assignment at a nearby ordnance depot, where prisoners were employed in inventory management under close supervision. The depot stored artillery shells, small arms ammunition, and various military supplies destined for shipment overseas. What impressed Hans most was not the quantity of materials, though the warehouses seemed to stretch beyond the horizon, but the absolute standardization of everything he observed. Every artillery shell was identical to every other shell of the same caliber, manufactured to specifications so precise that components were interchangeable between manufacturers. Ammunition boxes bore identical markings and were constructed to identical dimensions. Even small items like cartridge casings showed no variation in weight, dimensions, or manufacturing marks. This level of standardization revealed a manufacturing philosophy that was fundamentally different from German industrial practice. German production emphasized craftsmanship and individual attention to quality. Components were often hand-fitted, adjusted, and modified during assembly. This approach produced weapons of exceptional quality but limited quantity. American production emphasized reproducibility and systematic quality control. Rather than relying on individual craftsmanship, American manufacturers had developed production processes that ensured consistent quality across millions of identical units. This approach required massive investments in tooling, quality control systems, and worker training, but it enabled production rates that German industry could not match. The depot's supervisor, Sergeant First Class Michael O'Brien, provided Hans with insight into American quality control procedures. "Every batch of shells gets tested," O'Brien explained. "We fire samples from each production run to verify performance. If a batch fails testing, the entire production run gets scrapped, and the manufacturer has to identify and correct the problem before resuming production." Hans was struck by the implications of this statement. American quality control was so rigorous that entire production runs, representing thousands of artillery shells, could be discarded if they failed to meet specifications. This suggested an industrial capacity so vast that massive waste was acceptable in order to ensure reliability. Germany, by contrast, could not afford to discard production runs, and instead relied on individual inspection and adjustment to ensure quality. The mathematical implications were sobering. American industry was not only producing more ammunition than German industry, but was simultaneously maintaining higher quality standards while accepting waste rates that would be catastrophic for German production. This combination of quantity, quality, and acceptable waste revealed an industrial base of almost incomprehensible depth and sophistication. Hans' most comprehensive education in American industrial capacity came through his assignment to the camp's mail distribution center, where he processed correspondence between American military personnel and their families. Though he was not permitted to read personal correspondence, the sheer volume and geographic distribution of mail provided him with a unique perspective on the scope of American military operations. The mail distribution system itself was a revelation. Letters arrived from military personnel stationed on 6 continents, in dozens of countries, serving with hundreds of different units. The geographic scope of American military deployment suggested a logistical network of staggering complexity, capable of maintaining supply lines across global distances while ensuring that soldiers received regular mail delivery regardless of their location. More impressive was the consistency of the mail system. Letters from the Pacific Theater arrived on predictable schedules. Correspondence from European operations showed no significant delays, despite the obvious dangers of transatlantic shipping. Mail from training bases across the United States revealed a military infrastructure that extended into every state and most major cities. The camp's mail supervisor, Staff Sergeant Patricia Walsh, provided Hans with insight into the broader logistics network. "Military mail is just one part of the system," she explained. "The same supply chains that deliver mail also deliver ammunition, food, fuel, replacement equipment, and personnel. If we can get mail to every soldier, we can get them everything else they need as well." This casual statement revealed the true foundation of American military power. Not just the ability to produce massive quantities of war materials, but the capacity to deliver those materials anywhere in the world on predictable schedules. German military operations had consistently suffered from supply shortages and logistical breakdowns. American military operations seemed to assume unlimited supply availability regardless of geographic location. The evidence was visible in every aspect of camp operations. American personnel received regular shipments of fresh food, including items like oranges, coffee, and chocolate that had become luxuries in wartime Germany. Equipment was replaced regularly rather than repaired. Even prisoners received supplies that exceeded the standards Hans had known as a German soldier before his capture. By late 1944, Hans had developed a comprehensive understanding of American military philosophy through conversations with guards, access to American publications, and observation of daily operations. The American approach to warfare was fundamentally different from German doctrine, built on assumptions about industrial capacity that would have been impossible for Germany to implement. German military doctrine emphasized efficiency, conservation, and the careful application of limited resources. Elite units were preserved for decisive moments. Equipment was maintained and repaired to extend its useful life. Operations were planned around the assumption that losses could not easily be replaced. American military doctrine assumed abundance and planned for overwhelming force. Units were designed to be replaceable rather than irreplaceable. Equipment was expected to be discarded rather than maintained indefinitely. Operations were planned around the assumption that American industry could replace any losses while simultaneously increasing overall military strength. Colonel Morrison, the camp commander, inadvertently summarized this philosophy during a camp inspection in December 1944. Speaking to his staff in Hans's presence, Morrison noted, "The key to American victory isn't superior tactics or better individual soldiers. It's the fact that we can afford to make mistakes and recover from them. We can lose entire divisions and replace them. We can lose hundreds of aircraft and build more. The enemy can't." This statement crystallized Hans's understanding of his situation. Germany had built a military machine designed for quick, decisive victories that would end before industrial capacity became decisive. America had built a military machine designed for prolonged conflicts that would ultimately be decided by industrial output. The war had lasted long enough for American industrial advantages to become overwhelming. The mathematics supported this conclusion. By late 1944, American monthly aircraft production exceeded German annual production at the war's beginning. American monthly tank production approached German annual production in 1943. American naval construction had reached rates that enabled simultaneous operations in multiple theaters while maintaining convoy protection across global shipping routes. Hans's most profound moment of realization came in February 1945 through a conversation with a newly arrived German prisoner, Hauptmann Ernst Weber, who had been captured during the Battle of the Bulge. Weber brought news from the European theater that crystallized everything Hans had learned about American industrial capacity. "The American response to our offensive was incredible," Weber explained during one of their evening conversations. "We achieved complete tactical surprise, broke through their lines, and advanced nearly to Antwerp. Any rational enemy would have needed months to organize a counterattack. The Americans had fresh divisions moving against us within days. Their artillery ammunition seemed unlimited. Their air support operated around the clock, despite winter weather that should have grounded their aircraft." Weber's account provided Hans with a real-world example of American industrial power in action. The Battle of the Bulge had represented Germany's final major offensive operation, utilizing carefully hoarded reserves in a desperate attempt to achieve decisive victory. The American response demonstrated the practical implications of overwhelming industrial capacity, the ability to absorb massive surprise attacks, sustain enormous losses, and still mount immediate counterattacks with fresh equipment and personnel. "But what impressed me most," Weber continued, "wasn't their ability to stop our attack. It was their casual confidence that they could sustain any level of losses and continue fighting. Their soldiers talked as if unlimited reinforcements were available. Their officers planned operations as if equipment and ammunition were infinite. They weren't conserving anything because they didn't need to conserve anything." This insight revealed the psychological dimension of American industrial supremacy. German military planning had always been constrained by scarcity. Every decision involved calculations about resource allocation, equipment preservation, and personnel conservation. American military planning seemed to operate without such constraints, enabling tactical and strategic approaches that would be impossible for resource-limited opponents. Weber's most devastating revelation concerned German intelligence estimates of American production capacity. "We knew the Americans were out producing us," he admitted. "What we didn't understand was the margin. Our intelligence estimated American production at roughly twice German capacity. The actual ratio appears to be closer to 5-1 when you include their support for Allied production. 5-1. Hans absorbed this information with a mixture of awe and despair. Germany wasn't losing a competitive industrial race. It was being buried under an avalanche of production that exceeded its capacity by orders of magnitude. Hans's ultimate understanding of American industrial dominance came through an unexpected source, a letter from his brother Klaus, who had remained in Germany and was working in a munitions factory in the Ruhr Valley. The letter, which arrived in March 1945 after passing through military censorship, provided Hans with a direct comparison between German and American industrial conditions. Klaus wrote, "The factory operates constantly now, with shifts working around the clock, but production keeps falling behind quotas because we lack raw materials, spare parts, and skilled workers. Half our machinery needs repair, but replacement parts are not available. The workers are exhausted, and many are too young or too old for industrial labor. We produce what we can with what we have, but it is never enough." This description of German wartime industry contrasted sharply with everything Hans had observed about American production. While German factories struggled with material shortages and equipment breakdowns, American industry operated with casual abundance. While German workers labored under increasingly desperate conditions, American workers seemed to take reliable supply chains and well-maintained equipment for granted. The letter continued with Klaus's account of Allied bombing. "The RAF and American bombers come nearly every night now. They target not just the factories but the rail lines, power plants, and supply depots. Each attack disrupts production for days while we repair damage and restore utilities. The Americans seem to have unlimited bombs and unlimited aircraft. We cannot match their ability to sustain these attacks while simultaneously fighting on multiple fronts." This observation provided Hans with insight into the strategic dimension of American industrial capacity. Germany was not only being outproduced in absolute terms, but was simultaneously losing existing production capacity to Allied bombing campaigns. America was increasing production, while Germany's production capacity was being systematically destroyed. Klaus's final observation was the most telling. "What frightens me most is not that we are losing the war, but that we never had any realistic chance of winning it. The Americans have industrial capacity that exceeds our understanding. They are not just defeating us. They are demonstrating that our entire strategic approach was based on fundamental miscalculations about their economic strength." Reading his brother's letter, Hans finally understood the complete scope of Germany's strategic miscalculation. The decision to initiate war against America had been based on assumptions about American industrial capacity that were not just incorrect, but catastrophically inadequate. Germany had prepared to fight a limited war against an opponent with roughly comparable industrial strength. Instead, it had initiated a total war against an opponent whose industrial capacity exceeded Germany's by margins that made victory mathematically impossible. By April 1945, as news of Germany's collapsing military situation reached the prisoner camp, Hans possessed a comprehensive understanding of the mathematical foundations of German defeat. The numbers, accumulated through months of observation and conversation, painted a picture of overwhelming industrial disparity that explained not just why Germany was losing, but why it had never had any realistic prospect of victory. In terms of raw production, America had achieved dominance across every category of military equipment. Aircraft production in 1,944, America 96,318, Germany 40,593. Tank production in 1,944, America 17,565, Germany 19,002. Naval vessel construction in 1,944, America 2,247, Germany 1,156. These ratios represented the outcome of industrial mobilization programs that had fundamentally different assumptions about economic capacity and resource availability. But raw production figures understated American advantages because they did not account for production quality, reliability, or sustainability. American equipment was manufactured to standardized specifications that ensured interchangeability and simplified maintenance. German equipment, while often superior in individual performance, required specialized maintenance and suffered from parts availability problems. More importantly, American production was sustainable and accelerating, while German production had peaked and was declining. American industry operated with abundant raw materials, reliable energy supplies, and expanding workforce capacity. German industry struggled with resource shortages, bombing damage, and labor force depletion. The strategic implications were overwhelming. America could sustain military losses at rates that would destroy any other nation, while simultaneously increasing overall military strength. Germany had reached maximum military mobilization and could not replace losses at rates sufficient to maintain fighting strength. Hans's mathematical analysis, based on production figures and loss rates he had observed, suggested that Germany's position had become hopeless by late 1943. By 1944, American production advantages had become so overwhelming that German military resistance could only delay defeat, not prevent it. Hans's final and most devastating realization came through a conversation with Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, who visited the camp in April 1945 to interview prisoners for intelligence purposes. Harrison, who had previously worked as an industrial engineer, provided Hans with the most comprehensive explanation of American production philosophy he had encountered. The key to understanding American industry, Harrison explained, is that we don't optimize for efficiency in the European sense. We optimize for throughput and scalability. We'd rather build 10 adequate weapons than spend the same resources building one perfect weapon. This approach requires enormous initial investments in tooling and training, but it enables production rates that smaller economies cannot match. This philosophy represented a complete inversion of German industrial assumptions. German engineering emphasized precision, craftsmanship, and individual optimization. American engineering emphasized standardization, reproducibility, and system-level optimization. The two approaches led to fundamentally different outcomes when applied to military production. Harrison continued, "What your leadership never understood was that America's industrial capacity was only partially committed to military production, even at the height of the war. We maintained significant civilian production throughout the conflict because we had enough industrial capacity to fight a global war without requiring total economic mobilization. This gave us strategic flexibility that no other nation could match. Strategic flexibility through industrial abundance." This concept crystallized Hans's understanding of America's overwhelming advantage. While Germany had committed its entire economy to military production and still fell short of requirements, America had fought a global war while maintaining enough civilian production to ensure domestic prosperity and morale. The conversation's climax came when Harrison provided Hans with the statistic that would haunt him for the rest of his life. American industrial production, in 1944, exceeded the combined production of Germany, Japan, and Italy by a margin of approximately 3-1. We were simultaneously outproducing all of our enemies while supplying most of our allies. The mathematical outcome was inevitable from the moment the war became a contest of industrial capacity rather than tactical skill. 3-1 against all enemies combined. Hans struggled to process this information. Germany had not been defeated by superior American tactics or better individual equipment. It had been buried under an avalanche of production that exceeded the combined output of the entire Axis alliance. As Hans sat in silence, trying to absorb the implications of what he had learned, Harrison made one final observation that would echo in his memory forever. The tragedy from Germany's perspective is that this outcome was predictable from economic data that was publicly available before the war began. American industrial capacity was never a secret. Your leadership simply chose to ignore information that contradicted their assumptions about American resolve and capability. The definitive confirmation of everything Hans had learned came in May 1945, through a letter from Oberst Friedrich Kellner, his former regimental commander, who had been captured during the final collapse of German resistance. Kellner's letter, written from a prisoner camp in France, contained the admission that Hans had been waiting for without realizing it. "Hans, I must tell you something that I could never admit while we were fighting. By 1943, those of us in command positions understood that we could not win this war. The American industrial capacity that you are undoubtedly observing as a prisoner was visible to us through intelligence reports, captured equipment, and the sheer overwhelming nature of their attacks. We continued fighting not because we believed victory was possible, but because we had no alternative. The Americans didn't defeat us through superior tactics or individual courage, though they demonstrated both. They defeated us by making war production itself a weapon. Every day we delayed their victory. They became stronger, while we became weaker. Every battle we fought cost them replaceable resources, while costing us irreplaceable ones. We were fighting an enemy that could afford to make mistakes, sustain losses, and still increase their military strength. We could not. Kellner's letter continued with the admission that would validate everything Hans had observed and learned. What we could never say publicly, and what I suspect your American captors understand better than we ever did, is that this war was decided not by battlefield heroics, but by the mathematics of industrial production. The Americans built a war machine that could absorb any losses and continue fighting. We built a war machine that required near-perfect execution to have any chance of success. When the war became a contest of industrial endurance rather than tactical brilliance, the outcome became mathematically inevitable. We cannot win. We never could win. The industrial disparity was too overwhelming from the beginning. Reading these words from his former commander, Hans felt the final piece of understanding fall into place. Germany hadn't been defeated by superior American fighting ability or better individual weapons. It had been systematically overwhelmed by an industrial avalanche that made traditional military excellence irrelevant. Quality had been buried under quantity of such overwhelming proportions that tactical and strategic skill became meaningless. As Hans Müller prepared for repatriation in late 1945, having spent more than 2 years as a prisoner in America, he possessed an understanding of modern warfare that few Germans of his generation would ever achieve. His captivity had been, in the most ironic sense, an education in the realities of industrial combat and the mathematical foundations of military power in the 20th century. The America that had held him prisoner was not simply a nation that had won a war, it was a civilization that had redefined the very concept of military conflict. While European nations had approached World War II as an extension of traditional warfare emphasizing tactical skill, individual heroism, and careful resource management, America had transformed war into an industrial process subject to the same principles of mass production, quality control, and systematic optimization that characterized its civilian economy. This transformation had profound implications that extended far beyond the immediate military conflict. Hans had witnessed the emergence of a new form of national power based not on territorial control, population size, or natural resources, but on industrial capacity and organizational systems. America's victory had demonstrated that modern warfare would be decided by the ability to translate economic strength into military force at speeds and scales that traditional military thinking could not accommodate. The German prisoners who had arrived in America expecting to find a wealthy but militarily inexperienced opponent had instead encountered a military-industrial complex that operated according to principles they had never imagined possible. American victory had not required superior individual soldiers, better individual weapons, or more brilliant military leadership. It had required only the systematic application of industrial methods to military production at scales that made traditional military calculations obsolete. The lesson was devastating in its simplicity. In modern warfare, abundance defeats excellence, quantity overwhelms quality, and industrial capacity determines strategic outcomes more decisively than tactical skill or individual courage. Germany had prepared to fight a war based on traditional military principles against an opponent that had reinvented warfare itself as an industrial process. As Hans prepared to return to a Germany that had been physically and economically devastated by the war, he carried with him the knowledge that his homeland's defeat had been not just inevitable, but mathematically predetermined from the moment the conflict became a test of industrial strength rather than military skill. The Americans had not simply won the war. They had demonstrated that they possessed the industrial capacity to win any war against any conceivable coalition of opponents, as long as that war lasted long enough for industrial production to become the decisive factor. This was the ultimate revelation of Hans Müller's American captivity. He had witnessed not just the defeat of Germany, but the obsolescence of traditional military power itself. The future would belong to nations that could master the industrial organization of warfare, and America had established a standard of industrial military capacity that would define global power relationships for generations to come. In the end, the story of German prisoners confronting American industrial might was not really about prisoners of war at all. It was about the collision between two entirely different concepts of national power, and the devastating realization that traditional military excellence becomes irrelevant when confronted by industrial capacity of sufficient magnitude. The Americans had not simply outfought Germany, they had outproduced it so overwhelmingly that fighting itself became secondary to manufacturing. This was the mathematics of modern warfare. Victory through the systematic application of abundance to the problem of military force. It was a lesson that would reshape the post-war world and establish the template for military power in the industrial age. Hans Müller had been present for the revelation of a new form of warfare, one in which victory was manufactured rather than fought, and where industrial avalanches buried traditional military excellence under mountains of standardized, reliable, and overwhelmingly numerous tools of war. The age of industrial warfare had arrived, and America had demonstrated its mastery with such overwhelming completeness that no other nation could realistically aspire to challenge its military dominance as long as it maintained its industrial advantages. Hans returned to Germany carrying this knowledge, the bearer of news about a transformation in the nature of warfare itself that would define the remainder of the 20th century and beyond.